So today we're looking at a video from the Gravel Institute. In case you've never heard of them, well, they're basically a left-wing bootleg of PragerU. And in this video, they're going to explain to us why big government is oh so wonderfully swell. Yeah, let's get right into this.
There's one thing Americans can agree on.
That salsa is better with cilantro, that the Adam West version of Batman was the best, that pineapple is good on pizza. Okay, maybe not that last one.
We value democracy.
Maybe you do, but I sure as hell don't. Democracy sucks. It's 51% of the population getting to boss around the other 49%. That's not freedom, that's tyranny of the majority. And the founders of this country felt similarly. That's why America was established to be a republic, as opposed to a democracy. If you want to know why direct democracy doesn't work, look at ancient Athens. It devolved into tyranny real fast.
And in a democracy, leaders are elected by the people to represent the people's interests.
Which is literally impossible since the people aren't a monolith and comprise of a wide variety of different needs, demands, and interests. There's just no way to appoint one person to satisfy all of them.
One person, one vote.
So we can already tell right off the bat that this woman is woefully ignorant of how our country actually works. The United States doesn't operate on a one-man, one-vote system. Rather, we have institutions in place, such as the Electoral College and the Senate, because the United States isn't run by a single monolithic government. It's a conglomeration of 50 smaller states, all of which, even the small ones, have the right to be represented in the federal government.
So, why does everyone agree that the government doesn't really work for us?
Because it doesn't, and quite honestly can't. All government expenditures are by definition third-party purchases. What that basically means is that the government spends money that it doesn't create through taxation on services it doesn't use. This means that the government has no incentive to economize or provide quality services. So to answer your question simply, the government doesn't work for us because it can't.
Conservatives have an easy answer. Big government is the problem.
I love how this woman thinks conservatives are against big government. And while it might be true that conservatives are more skeptical of big government than the left, it doesn't mean that conservatives don't advocate for forms of authoritarianism, such as the drug war, border restrictions, restrictions on LGBT rights, bloated police and military budgets, etc. The list goes on and on.
They say the government infringes on people's freedoms and is constantly getting bigger.
Both of which are objectively true. It's objectively provable that the government has been growing and our liberties have been threatened as a result. Government only ever seems to expand, it never seems to shrink. And how often are federal agencies disbanded once it's determined there's no longer a need for them? Rarely ever, if at all, does it happen.
They say that if we just defund expensive government programs, we could lower taxes for the average American.
The funny thing about it is that the government is so piss poor at managing money that even if you did cut all those expensive programs, the government would probably still find some way to waste it, so you probably wouldn't get a tax decrease.
With that money back in the hands of ordinary people, they say, people could handle their problems on their own.
Well, yeah, that's because people know what their own needs and wants are, better than some big monolithic central bureaucracy can know it for them.
But there's a big problem with that. It's just not true.
All logic and evidence tells us that it is, but you know what, I'll go ahead and hear you out. I'm curious to see how you plan to debunk basic facts about economics, such as rational self-interest.
Sure, the US government is big.
Well, that's the understatement of the century. The US government currently spends over $20 billion a day. The Federal Registry, that is the book containing all of the federal regulations currently in effect, is over 7,000 pages long.
But not as big as it used to be.
So what? Even if that's true, that doesn't mean that our current government still isn't overly big and overly oppressive. It would be like if a cancer patient was told by their doctor that, hey, their cancer isn't as bad as it used to be, so let's just not worry about it. The fact that the cancer might not be as bad as it was before might be good news, sure, but should something still not be done about the cancer that remains?
As a percentage of the economy, federal spending is smaller now than it was in 1954.
Not really. I mean, according to your own graph, the difference appears to be marginal at best, and there still appears to be an overall upward trend if you look at the data long term. Another thing to keep in mind is that this is based on percentage of GDP, as opposed to raw dollar amount. This is important to point out because our economy has grown a lot since 1954, so 20% of GDP now is going to look a lot different than it would have back at that time.
And the US spends less on government than other countries, like Germany or Finland.
This is misleading for the same reason I mentioned a moment ago. It's based on percentage of GDP as opposed to raw dollar amount. Because different countries have different sized economies, this isn't an apples to apples comparison.
that have lower rates of poverty.
Poverty rates, as defined by the OECD, are determined by what percentage of the population earns below the median household income. Because different countries have a different median household income, different countries are going to have a different threshold for what level of income is considered poverty. So again, not an apples to apples comparison.
And higher rates of economic mobility.
So this claim regarding economic mobility comes from an article from the Economic Policy Institute. The approach that this article seems to take is to compare the income of parents versus their children. And this isn't actually the best approach to take when determining economic mobility, because there's a wide variety of different factors other than economic mobility that can determine how much a child makes versus their parents. For example, someone who lives in a more stable economy is more likely to make an income on par with their parents than someone who lives in a country with a developing economy. So this just isn't the best approach to take. We can also see that there are some big government countries that have less economic mobility than the US, so how do you account for that? Which is kind of a good segue into my biggest problem with this whole segment here, and that's that she never actually provides an explanation for how these big government policies actually do things like reduce poverty or increase social mobility. She basically just draws a correlation between different disparate data points and expects you to draw that conclusion for her. I mean, if the whole point of this video is to sell us on big government programs and policies, then why not explain how those policies reduce poverty or increase economic mobility?
The American dream is more alive in these big government countries than in America.
Well, the American dream is a bit of a vague concept that encompasses a wide variety of different things. That being said, freedom and individual liberty are big components of the American dream, both of which are at odds with big government.
And there's no truth to the claim that the bigger the government, the less free the people.
A bigger government inevitably leads to people being less free. This is because the bigger your government is, the more tax money it requires to operate, which means the more your government has to steal from its citizens to operate, which means less money they have to spend for themselves. It also means the government has more tentacles it can wrap up into people's personal and business lives. You're really trying to tell me that a machine that eats up more money and grows more tentacles as it gets bigger isn't a threat to our freedoms?
In fact, the countries that the Cato Institute, a libertarian think tank, ranks as freer than the United States, countries like Sweden or Denmark, have much larger governments relative to their populations than the United States.
This is actually a huge myth. It's true that a lot of European and Scandinavian countries have larger welfare states than the US, but they also have a lot less regulations, lower taxes, and a lot less government involvement in other sectors of the economy.
A large government doesn't mean an unfree population.
It almost always does, because in order to become bigger, a government has to tax and control its citizens more.
You see, government isn't a problem in and of itself.
It kind of is. I mean, the literal definition of a government is people who get to do things if they were wrong if the rest of us did it. They have the right to take your money by force and call it taxation. None of the rest of us can do that. They have the right to create rules for property they don't own and call it regulation. None of us have the right to do that.
In a country as sprawling and diverse as America, there needs to be an institution to build infrastructure and inspect food and to put out fires.
So what, you're telling me that if there were no government, nobody else would bother doing these? If building infrastructure, inspecting food, and putting out fires are services that there is a clear need and demand for, then why wouldn't anyone voluntarily come along and bother doing it?
To do things that help our communities, even if they don't turn a profit.
You do realize that private sector nonprofit organizations are a thing, right? Like, government doesn't have a monopoly on doing things not for profit.
Think of the U.S. Postal Service, which provides hundreds of thousands of good jobs while allowing people to cheaply mail packages across the country.
Yeah, so do UPS and FedEx. Again, just because government might not be doing something doesn't mean there isn't another institutional organization out there that could be doing the same thing.
Or think of Medicare and Medicaid, which are credited with having saved millions of lives.
I'm sure that Medicaid and Medicare may have been accredited with saving many lives, but the reality is a lot different. Healthcare costs have actually skyrocketed once these policies were implemented, and we've seen the negative effects of government involvement in healthcare in other countries, such as increased wait times and rationing. See Shenkilian's video, How to Argue for Universal Healthcare, for a more in-depth explanation of how government involvement in healthcare tends to cause issues.
So, The problem isn't the size of government.
The problem is still the size of government. Larger governments means more tax money gobbled up, and more tentacles the government can use to strangle our freedoms. Oh, and by the way, if you want the government to do things like the post office and fire department and inspecting food and all that stuff, we can still have all that with small government. There was a period of time in our country when there was no income tax. There were still roads, fire departments, post offices, etc. So we can still have everything this woman wants without big government.
It's who controls the government.
It's actually both. A larger government is more easily corruptible for whoever wants to control it on both sides. Like I said at the beginning of the video, if conservatives are in charge of your big government, you're still going to get waste and corruption. You're just going to get different waste and corruption.
The reason it feels like our politicians don't work for us is because, well, they don't.
Yeah, they don't and they can't. Politicians have no reason or incentive to work for you or take your interests into consideration. Like, yeah, sure, they might have to put on a facade in order to get elected, but once in office, they really don't have to do shit for you. They can just help themselves more money and more power, and there's not a whole lot you can do about it. So yeah, politicians don't work for you and they can't work for you.
Republicans and Democrats alike are working for the people who line their wallets instead.
So if you're admitting that this is a problem on both sides of the aisle, what's your solution then? What superhuman benevolent angel that's immune to self-interest and corruption is out there that we can put in charge of government to solve this problem?
That's not just my politics. That's the academic consensus. In 2014, a Princeton University study found that economic elites and organized groups representing business interests have substantial independent impacts on U.S. government policy.
So since she brought this up, I want to briefly discuss a narrative you're often spun by the left about this. The left will often talk about big, bad, greedy corporations corrupting our politics with money so that they can have things their way. But the truth is that most corporations would rather stay out of politics. If they had a choice, they'd rather not do any lobbying or spend any money on this. They only get involved in politics defensively to protect themselves against regulations that'll hurt their business. So it's not corporations corrupting politics, it's politics corrupting corporations. If it wasn't for the big, bloated regulatory administrative state, we might see a lot less lobbying.
More than that, they found that the desires of regular people have zero impact on policy adoption. Not a little impact, not barely any impact, no relationship at all.
I'm sorry, is the point of this video to sell me on big government? Because thus far it seems like you're saying that big government screws us over regardless of who's in charge. Like, hey guys, we should totally trust this institution that's easily corruptible and continuously works against our interests. Well, what the fuck, why?
And it's a truth that has been understood since the founding of the United States.
The history of political corruption goes back way before then even. Political corruption has been around for long as government has even been around. We're talking thousands of years. And in spite of all this mountains of evidence, this long history that shows that all governments do is become corrupt and tyrannical, people still insist that civilization simply can't exist without it.
Thomas Jefferson wrote of his desire to crush in its birth the aristocracy of our moneyed corporations.
You do know that Thomas Jefferson was basically a libertarian, right? Not only was he one of the people who led the charge in the Revolution against England, but he was also a huge anti-federalist. He was very skeptical of concentration of power, and he opposed the central bank. Hardly a person you want to cite in making a case for big government.
But blinded by swanky dinner parties and big donations, some politicians have forgotten his words.
Oh no, they haven't forgotten, they just don't give a shit. Politicians aren't these benevolent angels that you think they are. They're regular human beings, subject to the same self-interest that the rest of us are. And usually all they want to do is grab at money and power.
The top ranks of both parties today are filled with billionaires, banking executives, and wealthy lobbyists.
Right, and you want to give the institution controlled by said billionaires, banking executives, and wealthy lobbyists more power to control our lives.
Corporations regularly give money to politicians on both sides of the aisle.
So again, if you're admitting that this is a problem that exists on both sides of the aisle, then who do you propose we put in charge to solve this problem?
Guaranteeing their influence no matter who wins an election.
Another reason that voting is a huge waste of time.
Whoever wins, you lose.
You know, I could have sworn this was a video making a case in favor of big government, but you know what? This is the one correct thing she said the entire video. Yes, whoever's in charge of government, you lose. Because you still get your money forcibly taken from you to spend on things you may or may not want, and get bossed around.
With a government under the control of corporations and the rich, the system has been rigged completely in their favor.
All the more bizarre that you think said system should have more power.
In the 1950s, when the economy was growing faster than ever, the richest people in the country paid an income tax of 91%.
The reason our economy was growing faster than ever in the 1950s has nothing to do with taxation. It's because our country was recovering from 2 wars and a depression.
The corporate income tax was above 50%.
All that a high corporate tax rate does is just encourage companies to invest more resources overseas. It doesn't actually grow the economy, it actually does the opposite.
But after decades of tax cuts for the rich, the 400 richest Americans pay a lower tax rate than the bottom 10%.
So this point here is misleading because it only looks at taxes for the rich being cut and doesn't look at how taxes were also cut for the middle and lower classes, all of which led to more economic growth, by the way. And even if the rich do technically pay a lower tax rate than the lower and middle classes, that doesn't mean they pay less taxes overall.
Corporations, elites, and the politicians they control will justify this inequality by saying that different rules for them mean more wealth for all. But recent history shows that's not the case.
Well, then I say we can avoid the issue altogether by either charging everyone an equal tax rate or even making taxation voluntary.
While American workers have become dramatically more productive, their wages have stagnated or fallen. The average hourly wage was higher in 1974 than it was in 2018.
This is another misleading point because they're comparing raw dollar amounts without adjusting for inflation or taking into consideration any ways that the quality of life may have improved. Yes, it's true that you might be making less in 2018 than you were in 1974, but things are also cheaper and more available in 2018, so your overall quality of life improved.
This has led to a stark gap in qualities of life. From 1989 to 2018, the wealthiest 1% of Americans increased their total net worth by $21 trillion. The bottom 50%, meanwhile, saw their net worth decrease by $900 billion.
So it is true that the wealth gap in our country is growing way too wide, but that's largely because of big government, not in spite of it. Regulations such as minimum wage and mandatory benefits make it harder for people to find jobs, and taxes and regulations make it more difficult for people to start their own business and lift themselves out of poverty.
The rich got richer, the poor got poorer.
Not necessarily. While yes, it is true that the gap between the wealthy and the poor has grown wider, the quality of life of the poor has actually increased a lot significantly as well. Low-income households can afford things like televisions, computers, refrigerators, cars. These are things that the wealthy in some other countries don't even have.
For too long, we have been presented with a false choice: big government versus small government. We're right to be skeptical of the people who lead us. They don't work for you or for me, but it's not because government is big. It's because it's bought.
Big government inevitably leads to bought government, however. This is because the bigger your government, the more influence and power that it has, and therefore the more people benefit from trying to corrupt it in their favor. So if you want government to remain neutral and uncorrupted, best to keep it small. Until next time, this has been Philosophos making stupidity play dead. Everyone take care.